I rather thought that at one stage Canada could be shamed into action, but I don't know that that's the case. We're expert at rhetoric and exceedingly poor in delivery. Successive governments have failed abjectly to honor their principal responsibility of appropriate defense.
This is the Expert Series podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. I'm Josh Malm, and it's Thursday, May 29th, 2025. Today's episode will be a recording of a panel moderated by my colleague and CDAI Junior Fellow, Claire Parsons.
One of the things that we anticipate that we might learn in our time here as the means by which Taiwan has maintained its democracy, I dare say strengthened its democracy, has maintained and strengthened its prosperity, notwithstanding a massive efforts on our...
As our listeners well know, the Indo-Pacific has emerged as a critical geopolitical flashpoint. China is rapidly expanding its naval forces and asserting control over key maritime areas in the Indo-Pacific, particularly around Taiwan in the South China Sea, thus in the process strengthening its regional dominance while also challenging the influence of the United States and its allies. Taiwan sits at the strategic center of the Indo-Pacific, serving as a critical hinge for China's regional ambitions, making its security vital not only to regional stability, but also to global trade and the interests of countries like Canada and its allies. Canada's economy is deeply tied to the region through trade and critical shipping routes. Balancing economic interests with China against alliance commitments and regional stability puts Canada in a difficult and uncertain position where it's being forced to reassess its strategic priorities, defense posture, and diplomatic engagement. Today I'll be joined by Dr. Michael Hennessy, Dr. James Boutlier, and Dr. Frederic Grare for a panel discussion that will examine how best to confront the shifting geopolitical realities of the Indo-Pacific, where old assumptions about U.S. dominance and alliances may no longer hold. We'll explore what that means for countries like Canada in a fragmented and increasingly uncertain geopolitical environment. We'll also look at the importance of Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific balance of power, the rapid growth of China's naval capabilities, and the lack of strategic clarity in Canada's approach to the region. My colleague Claire Parsons will take it from here. I do hope you enjoyed today's program.
Today I'm joined by Dr. Michael Hennessy, who's here representing himself as an individual academic and by national defense, as well as Dr. James Boutlier and Dr. Frederic Grare. And today we're going to be talking about Indo-Pacific and naval strategy. Let's start here. First question, mainly about alliances and growing tensions here. Several allied navies, particularly Western navies, are deployed in the South China Sea working on a variety of projects, be it military exercises, cooperating with Indo-Pacific allies and their navies on things like illegal fishing or training. These exercises are, of course, as an end goal, seeking to address the possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan, especially as China has escalated its aggression, saying that, whether they like it or not, Taiwan will be a member of China by 2027. So just as a baseline for our listeners to get an understanding of where Canada and its allies are, how are Canada and its allies already preparing for a possibility of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, and what are the pros and cons of our current approach? Anyone can start if they like.
Well, thank you, Claire. That's a fascinating and provocative set of questions. Perhaps with your permission, I might spend a moment or two just referring to the question of geography in the Western Pacific. I think it's vitally important for our listeners to appreciate the huge size of the ocean. The Atlantic is relatively tiny by Pacific standards, the complexity of the ocean, and the nature of the geography close up to the Asian shore. Because if you look at your map of the Pacific, what you see is that starting with the Peninsula in Pacific Russia, and leading south through the Japanese home islands, through Taiwan, through the Philippines, and on into Indonesia. What we have is a series of curved island chains which separate the Pacific from the coast of China. And what the Chinese ambition is, by way of background to the discussion today, is to gain outright control of the seas between the Chinese coast and that first island chain. And Taiwan is absolutely critical. It is the great hinge in the chain. So from a geostrategic perspective, quite a little apart from the ideological issues at stake for the Chinese leadership, control of Taiwan is vitally important if China is to control the whole of the Western Pacific. And similarly, if we move south, what we see is a series of enclosed seas, which the South China Sea is probably the principal one. It's about 85% the size of the Mediterranean, but it is absolutely, utterly vital to the Chinese to deny that sea to other powers. That said, and having set the stage, if I may go on for just another moment or two, what we've seen is that the Americans are increasingly aware of and indeed anxious about the balance in the Pacific. While they were distracted by the war in the Middle East from basically 9/11 on to 2020, the Chinese Navy has doubled, tripled in size, and indeed in the first 8 months of 2019, the Chinese built more warships than in the Canadian Navy itself. So what we see is the Americans increasingly alarmed about the overall balance, about the arrogant and bullying and harassing policy of the Chinese in the South China Sea, and about comparable harassment of the Taiwanese defense establishment. So perhaps I should cut away and let our other experts comment, but I thought it was important to try to set the stage in terms of the geography of the region, which is central to, I think, an understanding of the geostrategy of the Western Pacific.
Yeah, I'll just, I think it's very valuable what Jim has just said, that whole sense of the first island chain and the second island chain and the importance geostrategically and geopolitically for China and the United States and all the powers of the region. I'm not sure the imminence of the threat, though. I mean, China has clearly evinced its desire to, the PRCs evinced its desire to unify with Taiwan. Whether or not the Taiwanese want that unification. But I'm not sure they've set a date of 2027. It's been intimated because it's an important anniversary for the Chinese Communist Party. And there are some other dates going forward that are important historically. But China's in a good position to wait and build up its strength. It doesn't mean it's not becoming more and more aggressive in the region. It quite clearly has been. Very sharp elbows, built a coast guard with, it's got its largest cutters are designed because under maritime law, the larger ship gets to kind of set the right of way and ram smaller ships that don't move out of its way. That's a very purposeful design feature of their Navy, of their Coast Guard, right? So they are clearly acting aggressively. They've empowered their Coast Guard to do a bunch of things that other Coast Guards wouldn't do, let alone their Navy exercising, nearly halfway across the Pacific. But I'm not sure we have the imminence of the threat, although a lot of harassment and wearing down of Taiwanese resources, exhausting its Air Force by having them to respond, et cetera. So that behavior is real, but I'm not sure invasions, we're at the edge of it.
I do concur with what was just said about the imminence of the threat. It's not clear whether 2029 is actually a deadline of any kind. What I want to insist a little bit upon is the fact that, yes, Taiwan is central in all consideration with the South China Sea, but this is not the only consideration. clearly there is also the need for China to access raw material and energy from the Middle East and Africa, and therefore the South China Sea has a value for itself. Now, what we have seen over the past few years is sort of a negligence of life for a long, long time. I mean, the island state or the small island or islet that China was weaponizing were deemed as unimportant or of their action easy to counter anything. And what they have been doing so far is just increasing the cost of whatever would or could be done against them. Now, to answer your question, what is it that we're doing to prepare against it? The truth is not that much, in fact, apart from the Americans. We are, of course, reasserting international law, which is important because China there is trying to distort international law in more than one way, including in what you described in your first topic. This is IU fishing and so on, distorting the entire fisheries law in their favor as a way of asserting their territorial claims. But we also should consider that because the South China Sea is the Chinese way towards the Indian Ocean, the Middle East, the Africa, and Europe, which is a large market to them as well, then there are means of pressure there. And what we have seen over the past few years is a building up of alliances or at least partnership in the Indian Ocean, reinforcement of capacity, increase of development, multiplication of exercises. But again, what we are seeing here is a strategy which is a sort of a salami slicing in which the stake is never commensurate with the risk, and therefore no one is actually ready to take an immediate risk. And the cost of it, which year after year is increasing and is creating a serious problem for all of us.
Yeah, I think an important feature from a kind of a naval strategy point of view is, the role of navies in what are called presence operations. There's war fighting and preparing to fight a war is one thing, but navies having a quasi-diplomatic role to show the flag and demonstrate resolve and act jointly as part of a coalition to demonstrate interest is an important naval function. And in this region, I think it's an important function. Part of that posturing is about preserving peace. It's not about fighting a war. It's about encouraging people to think twice that a war would not be an easy win, that it's a complicated assessment they would have to make. And kind of enhanced constant naval presence. Britain is sending an aircraft carrier group. It's on its way now. Canada's been contributing, making purposeful transits of the Straits of Taiwan. Those aren't to threaten, but they are to demonstrate an interest in the region that says this is not a cakewalk if China wanted to invade Taiwan. At least it can't be taken for granted that no external forces are going to do anything. And that's an important role in preserving, peace.
Absolutely.
But I think forgive me, I was going to say, but I think coming back to your original question, two things I might say. One is that the White House is nominally, at least, gripped with the realization that the current shipbuilding capacity of the United States is woefully inadequate to the potential of any hostilities in the Western Pacific. And the other is the tyranny of distance, that the U.S. Navy has to operate at 10 to 11,000 kilometers from the California coast, whereas the Chinese, in any sort of Taiwanese operation, are literally within 100, 120 kilometers of their target. And this drives the whole coalition building emphasis for the Americans in terms of AUKUS in Australia, trying to draw the Indians into a maritime defense in the Indian Ocean and in Southeast Asia, and also encouraging the Japanese, who are undergoing a major generational shift in terms of their attitude towards defense and security, to participate in terms of naval operations.
Yeah, this is fantastic. I think a couple things I particularly want to highlight. One being that there's a significant strategic gap currently in naval strategy in the Indo-Pacific, and a capacity gap as well. So missing both the physical capacity of ships to engage in that naval diplomacy and also to defend if necessary, but also a fundamental lack of plan if there was to be an escalation. Dr. Hennessy, would love to pry into your technical naval mind for a moment before going back to the broader geopolitical and international relations perspectives. I'd like to ask you about the 3 large barrages that China has developed that link together to create a movable port. They are titanic in size and increase the capacity for China to not only engage in naval invasion, but to multiply their capacity for land invasion, creating a far more effective multi-branch approach to an invasion of Taiwan. How does the strategic picture of the Indo-Pacific shift? Because when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, we really focus in on the South China Sea, but China is multiple steps ahead in terms of thinking about how it wants to potentially approach this. What are some new strategic thoughts that we should be having, especially as we see these barrages start to be developed?
So, I mean, it's an interesting kind of technical issue, right? China is clearly developing its amphibious warfare capacity to launch large-scale landing operations. A number of its very large civilian ferries, we know an exercise about a year or 2 years ago were, taken off their civilian routes and used to move masses of troops. So developing the capacity is part of it. As from a kind of a tactical naval invasion of Taiwan, China has already a lot of the capacity to do that. So it's huge risk, right? Developing your capacity is not the same thing as using it. So we're going to see those developments. Do they really destabilize things much more? China has to have its own entire dialogue, which is, I think, uncertain right now. There's a lot of instability in the military regime in China for a bunch of reasons. They would have to have the appetite for war or some decision to go to war. They could do that with a fully developed force, or as naval warfare history would tell you, most naval wars happen when navies say they're not ready. And no Navy, I think, has ever said, we're fully ready for war. There's just so many things you can always build. So that's the reality we're just going to face. The tactical problem of moving tens of thousands of troops in mass, having them survive for a crossing of something like 120, 110 kilometers, which all can be surveilled, mostly from Taiwan, from space. That'll be a big bloody battle if the Taiwanese put up initial resistance. If they don't put up initial resistance, it could be over very quickly. That's a big unknown. And who's going to intervene? I don't know what the tripwires are. Canada's not in a position to say we're making a commitment to be there. There's a big historical record of why we wouldn't say that anyway, set up front. But avoiding war is, I think, one of the big strategic things to worry about in the Pacific. And some of the naval posturing is about preventing war, a deterrent effect of some of the naval buildup. It's one of those paradoxes of an arms race, if the ultimate aim is to preserve peace. Canada has a lot of interest in preserving peace. We may not ever get any credit from the United States for doing very much around the security of Taiwan. That the U.S. commander of the Indo-Pacific Command just, spoke to Congress, mentioned a whole bunch of countries, never mentioned Canada. So we're not doing it for credit. But intrinsically, there's a lot of reasons Canada wants a hand in preserving the peace in the Indo-Pacific region. Does it want to fight a war in the Pacific region? I don't think it does. Nor should it be fully prepared to fight a war that is not our war. Right? But preserving the peace, I think, is an important function.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
No, please go ahead.
Which I believe raises an interesting question, which is preserving the peace is essential. But war is not the only way for China to coerce Taiwan into joining mainland China at some point, and therefore it's the sense of preserving the peace if that happens at some point. The second aspect of it is preserving the peace is one thing, but I mean, you do preserve the peace because you also want to preserve the advantage that you may have in Taiwan being what it is. If you start losing interest in whatever is produced in China, because, for example, if we think of the semiconductor industry, this is resourced somewhere else, then the situation is very different. So there are a number of things which have to be taken into account in that discussion, not just the military thing. I mean, I do agree with you that this is a war in the Pacific, which is not seen by most actors like their war, even if there would be consequences at some point, which create a big problem, because at the end of the day, are we so sure that the only country which is capable of countering it is actually willing to do so? And there is no definitive answer to that. This is an evolving process. And that's precisely what is going to be key, absolutely key in the years to come.
I think perhaps there are three issues to consider when we come to Canada. One is that our timing, unfortunately, is terrible. We are in effect trapped between an aging fleet of wonderful ships, the Halifax-class frigates, and the follow-on generation of Canadian surface combatants. We're looking at a 10-year period where our fleet will be under enormous pressure in terms of availability. Secondly, the diplomatic decisions that needed to have been made and were not made with respect to our relations with Japan, South Korea, and one or two other nations on the Asian littoral, in the sense that we desperately need to have in place all of the necessary diplomatic arrangements for maintenance, for rotation of personnel and so forth, because we simply cannot afford, in the event of any sort of hostilities in which we might be involved, to face the prospect of trying to return to Canada to effect those repairs or changes of personnel. And that also relates to the third and critical issue, and that's logistics. And I think that one of the lessons from the current Ukrainian conflict is that contemporary military logistics are voracious, to say the least. Quite apart from whether we have the missiles or the ammunition or what have you for our new generation of ships whenever they're available sometime in the 2030s, we need to have those available in Asian waters, not here in Canada. So from the perspective of our participation from naval point of view, our timing, as I suggest, is extraordinarily awkward. And the same, I should say, by way of footnote, applies to our pending decision to acquire 12 submarines. Those may, and I have no insider information whatsoever, but those may very well originate out of South Korea. And that, once again, will raise a series of diplomatic and practical concerns in terms of long-term maintenance, rotation of crews, and so forth.
Well, if you ever do get any insider information about those submarines, do let us know.
That.
Yeah, fantastic. We look at the Canadian procurement perspective. I'm building on your thoughts on the submarines, the new icebreakers that are being purchased, lots of naval investment being put into the Arctic region, as that's a geostrategic region for Canada, with the national shipbuilding strategy really focusing in on that area. But when we look at the Indo-Pacific and we narrow in here, if I'm hearing everyone correctly, on naval diplomacy, a really unsung, duty of the Navy, the question changes from what is the physical equipment needed not only to operate in the Indo-Pacific, and that's still an important question that is necessary to ask, but what do our allies need in the Indo-Pacific? The Association of Southeastern Asian Nations, South Korea, Japan, vital allies. So I ask in twofold, sort of as a follow-up here. what does a Western ally like a Canada, a United States, a United Kingdom need navally to engage well in the region, in contrast to essential allies in Southeast Asia, South Korea and Japan? And what is needed next for these two sort of regional groups to work in tandem? A simple, easy question, I know.
Well, I think some of that depends on the partner navy. Go ahead, are important, right? But one thing, say, the Canadian Navy brings into a theater of mixed allies is some of its capacity is fairly unique, but also very high end. But we might operate similar systems, but not the same way the U.S. Navy operates. And sometimes talking to a small service, it is enriching both ways, because when you're a superpower and you can afford everything and have multiples of multiples and build specialized classes of ships to do certain things, it's a different dialogue you have with partners who don't have those capacities, because everybody's trying to fill the gap. So what are the critical enablers for everybody to cooperate? The communications protocols, the maneuvering protocols, the protocols on, basic things like picket and controlling radars and operating across divergent systems are all things that get exercised and are valuable. And you need to exercise those in peacetime, because you don't want to discover the gaps in wartime. So those are valuable contributions. And I know in work, say, the Canadian Navy, some of the Japanese Navy, there's been a lot of dialogue two ways and a lot of learning going both ways about, the Japanese have been very capable Navy, very high-end Navy, but they don't necessarily do things the way we do them. And that's an important dialogue.
I think the Japanese attitude towards the balance of power in Asia has begun to shift quite dramatically, despite uncertainties with respect to Liberal Party continuity and so forth in Tokyo. The Hiroshima generation is disappearing from the scene. And now there's a new pragmatism brought about in large part by the aggressive nature of Chinese foreign policy in recent years, the constant harassment of the southern end of the Japanese home islands, of islets claimed by both China and Japan, like the Diaoyutai or Senkaku Islands. But the Japanese have come out of their shell, and they're now becoming much more aggressive in terms of assisting smaller nations like the Philippines, for example, to develop their maritime capacity over and against the harassing tactics of the Chinese. Similarly, the South Koreans have emerged as major major source of defense equipment, particularly in the Ukraine, or in European NATO nations during the Ukraine conflict. But we have to think about the cascading effect, I think, if there were a conflict as distinct from a slow motion strangulation of the Taiwanese economy by distant blockade. We have to think about what would happen. Would the South Koreans be drawn into this conflict in any way? Would the North Koreans utilize that as an opportunity to, in fact, try to seize control on the peninsula? What would the Japanese position be? Because historically and emotionally, there are some strong ties with Taiwan. Would they venture to become involved? And what about the Russians? The Russo-Chinese relationship, because were the Russians to begin inserting their submarines into Pacific conflict, this would change things dramatically. So there are many moving pieces, I think, in this puzzle, with a great deal of uncertainty about the levels of participation. And the nations of Southeast Asia, I think, are simply biding their time, because they desperately want to rely on the United States, but feel they no longer can. So they're in an extremely awkward position. And this is one of the reasons why it's been almost a quarter of a century that they've tried desperately to get a code of conduct with the Chinese in the South China Sea. And the Chinese, frankly, have played them like skilled trout fishermen and simply reeled them in and reeled them out decade after decade without any success. But the South East Asian nations do have naval assets increasingly. For example, the Singaporeans, the Malaysians, but they're in fact tending to keep them under wraps in terms of this impending conflict.
If I may, I'd like to come back to this notion of uncertainty regarding U.S. guarantees, because we all agree on that, but we all keep talking as if we were the U.S., that is a global power, in the process of answering another global power. And there is a dimension to it when we speak of alliances, partnership, and all the rest of it. But we should perhaps also, if we want to assess really the capacity question, we have to go back to the definition of the Indo-Pacific. This is not primarily a geographic entity. I mean, there is this former head of ONA, Alan Ginger, who said the Indo-Pacific doesn't exist. This is a way for government to frame their interest in the region and so on. And I think this is very true. In other words, what everybody is doing is defining the Pacific ordering to its own interest according to its own term, and therefore adapt its own capacities according to that. We all have a gap into this. We don't know. And so far, we have all taken into account the fact that the US would bring the sort of security guarantee that since about a month or two, we no longer consider as granted, and therefore that raises a lot of questions. But I mean, the real question that we will have now is, could we keep thinking the same way in the same categories that we used to do, and the capacity question will have to be framed according to that, and we may end up with a very, very different framework at the end of the process.
Yeah, the question of the United States and its future in diplomatic engagements are touch and go day to day. So let's continue this line of thought by identifying who can take the place of the United States. Now, no one's ever going to be a complete match. Obviously, we're talking about a global power here. Other Five Eyes allies, including Australia and New Zealand, have been essential to at least the intelligence process in the Indo-Pacific, as well as the French and the British. So as the region is looking for guidance, especially as two other global powers really narrow in on the region, geopolitically, who or what coalition could step forward and address that sort of vacuum on that balance of the scale?
I think the
Go ahead.
The resounding silence suggests that there is no one, that there are candidates, but they're not going to step forward if the United States is not to hand. And please, Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, it's such an abstraction. The reality is we have the United States with an ambiguous commitment, purposely ambiguous commitment to defend Taiwan, which we hope they don't get called on. And it's been ambiguous on purpose. So I think that's just the state of affairs you have to live with. Is there any player equal to, in measure, that could replace the United States if it chose not to live up to that commitment? I mean, the reality is no. But it does raise the prospect of, like-minded countries having to think about how to have presence operations and demonstrate resolve, whether or not the biggest player wants to do the same thing. And there's some room for work there. Bilateral relations, Canada, Japan, Canada, the Philippines, Canada, Singapore, I think very large potential for great relations between Canada and Australia. not just on naval affairs, but on trade affairs, on nuclear propulsion development, et cetera. There's a whole host of areas where there's lots of opportunities. It's been, the reality is Canada's talked about aiming and looking to Pacific for, a century. It's always hard to do because it's a long way away and you have huge language barriers. And you're not going to escape those things. We do have a growing diaspora community that helps with the language barriers. Mm-hmm. We haven't exploited them.
If I just want to rebound on that, the question of demonstrating resolve is one thing, but unless there is sufficient capacity behind its resolve, then this is something which is, let's say, ambiguous at the very least. Now, the reality is that even with those demonstration of resolve so far in the South China Sea, at least, the Chinese have kept increasing their own capability. They have kept developing weapon system everywhere. So, we shouldn't fool ourselves with the idea that we can compensate for I don't think that any of us think that anyway. Yeah. We can compensate for the US in any reasonable way or any meaningful way. Now, again, as you said, we'll have to think in different terms as well. We'll have to see in economic terms and so on. I'm not sure I would see it the same way than you do because, and we'll probably discuss it later, we are in a period where the very idea of globalization is not taboo, but being increasingly difficult. If you listen to the narrative of every single country today, this is about resilience, and resilience means, for many of them at least, developing indigenous capacities, be it industrial, being technological, being a number of things. So there we are in things which are pretty complicated. I think the best we can do, and this is where I think there will be a big change of the mindset in the months and years to come, is issue-based coalition building. On specific issues together, we can probably do things that will have a specific impact somewhere. But the capacity to act globally at every the energy, especially the military one, is definitely not there. I think we have to redo that.
But in many ways, perhaps Putin and Trump have done us a favor, or they should have done, in the sense that the Ukraine conflict and the emerging conflicts in Asian waters should, in many ways, have spurred us to action. I don't know that it has. I rather thought that at one stage Canada could be shamed into action, but I don't know that that's the case. We're expert at rhetoric and exceedingly poor in delivery. Successive governments have failed abjectly to honor their principal responsibility of appropriate defense. And this brings home, I think, this discussion, the very challenges that are involved in a distant theater of war. But even closer to home, we have failed when it comes, for example, to the Arctic. There's a huge amount to be done beyond rhetoric, but we have no sense of urgency, no sense of vision, and no sense of leadership in the past 20 years of political leadership. So it's a serious issue. Quite apart from the specifics of the South China Sea, we should be taking heed of the fact that we have allowed ourselves to become hopelessly weakened, and we have long imagined that we could rely on the United States, but now we've discovered, to our amazement and perhaps horror, that we can no longer do that. So there are, I think, a series of sobering lessons inherent in this discussion today.
Absolutely. When we think about urgency, the data shows that if conflict in the South China Sea broke out tomorrow, that 10% of the global economy would be directly disrupted and would level significant economic stress, particularly on Canada and the United States, who are already experiencing economic stress. when we look at the foreign policy aspect, stepping away from the naval strategy aspect for a moment, or maybe even coming back to it if naval diplomacy strikes our guests here, what can be done to create more stability economically for that 10% of the major economy? So that means either in North America and Europe, as well as in the Southeast Asian nations, who obviously heavily rely on those transit lines and waterways.
Yeah, I think that number is actually optimistic. I think the economic impact would be worse as we shut down shipping in the Pacific. We've seen it before. A large war is going to impact global shipping, not just regional shipping, but global shipping. Freight costs will go up. There's all sorts of issues of war insurance. There's issues of ships not plying those waters because they're war zones. So how big that war zone is just going to impact everybody who's on the edge of the Pacific, the top to bottom. That's certainly the experience of the First World War and the experience of the Second World War. Doing things, I think, to explain to a bunch of countries the difficulty everyone will have if there's a war in the Pacific, I think is part of a diplomatic discussion to have. Because it's in everyone's best interest to have stable trading relations as much as possible and avoid a huge disruption of shipping. We're going to see that coming up now with Chinese ships being banned from American ports. It's starting to impact things already. They'll give us a little taste, but that's not going to be as bad as an actual war. So I think just getting ready to understand that what happens to global shipping when you have a large oceanic war between two powers who are operating in vast ocean distances, imperiling all merchant shipping within them in probably the most important shipping lanes of the world.
Well, I certainly agree with the fact that I don't know where you get those 10%, because if a war started in the South China Sea, then that would mean problems in shipping, as Dr. Hennessy just said, but it would mean a lot of other problems as well. How do you continue economic relation with your main adversary, China, in a situation where all your allies are being affected by what China does? And we are seeing the kind of consequences the Ukraine war has on the rest of the world, whether countries were involved or not, in terms of inflation, in terms of many things. So I think the damage would be much larger. So all we have to do, it's all in the prevention exercise. This is about diplomacy. This is about many things right now. This is also about preserving whatever can be preserved about globalization, FTA, and all the rest of it. The problem is for the latest, it's extremely complicated in the current situation. We are facing a protectionist trend. This is, of course, referring to the US tariffs, but this is not only the US. Look at the FTA, the term between Canada and Europe, for example, or between Europe and Mercosur, and so on and so forth. So there we have a structural problems that we will be extremely difficult to address. So our best bet is in diplomacy right now and trying to prevent whatever can be prevented. But this is really a fine line to walk because, as you said, naval diplomacy is about peace and preventing war, but naval diplomacy does not necessarily stop everything which is doing it. Naval diplomacy, up to a point, reinforces the security dilemma that China is faced with in the region. So it's a fairly complicated process. What we haven't really discussed is China's readiness to go to war. Capacities are one thing, but capacities are not everything. The risk for China would also be tremendous in the whole thing. And that's something we have to take into account, that's something we cannot really measure. But that's where we stand. So this is a very unstable equilibrium that we are faced with. This is one which instability is increasing, not by the day, but at least by the month, at the moment at least.
And I think it's vitally important that we also consider for a moment the domestic balance within China itself. because Xi and his senior colleagues in the CCP are faced with a series of major structural challenges in contemporary China. Not only in terms of the laggardly nature of the Chinese economy, but demography, natural resource availability, for example, in water, and a number of other constraints that apply to the application of Chinese national powers. So that, and of course, the rather sobering experience of the Ukraine conflict may very well have tempered Xi's ambitions. I think he wants to be part of the great trifecta in the sky with Mao, Deng Xiaoping, and himself, and reincorporating Taiwan would ensure that in his estimation. But I think that there are some serious challenges to Xi's power currently that may have a bearing. It's difficult to define exactly what they are, but may have a bearing on the overall balance in the Western Pacific.
Yeah, I mean, China's a wild card in many ways that we don't know the degree of regime stability, internal stability, the succession process that preexisted was eliminated by him. So that's a huge wild card in what's going on. We know there's purging of the military, 2 or 3 senior members of the Central Committee, the military committee, have been removed in the past year, I think, or less than a year. Major disruption of, the head of the rocket forces being dismissed for finding rocks and water stored in fuel tanks. So those are all internal things we know very little about. We're seeing a little tip of an iceberg of indications that it's not, a nice, strong, uniform, stalwart China acting with one voice. It's anything but that. So that's why I say I think the imminence of war is not there. Unless there was some strange precipitous act, which made the Chinese rile up and say they have to act. But besides that, I don't see the kind of imminent threat. But I do see all the neighbors getting more and more concerned about the regional security. And, there are surface air missiles stationed around Tokyo. That's happened in the past decade. If you were there 20 years ago, they weren't parked around Tokyo. They've been parked around Tokyo because there's a real air threat. We don't face that in Canada, we don't believe. Our sense of urgency is still mediated by distance and the kind of historical record of being dependent of a great ally to the south, who may not be an ally and may not be there when we need them. But our strategic mindset has largely been framed with that in mind. And, you read our defense documents and they're all largely couched about doing things to demonstrate to others that we're doing things, as opposed to having a strategic sense of this is the right thing strategically to do in the grand picture of what you're going to achieve. Australia's done more to kind of articulate its strategic vision of how it is an actor and the role it can play, given its limited resources and the geographic realities and its, human resource realities, than Canada has done. So it's time for us to have that more honest dialogue and a greater strategic vision. But we also have to look, a bunch of our regional allies are looking at, there's serious discussion of nuclearization in South Korea of, what would have been unheard of 5 years ago, discussion in Japan.
Well, and parenthetically, our lack of reality when it comes to defense is a major reputational challenge in the Indo-Pacific region, because to put it colloquially, they see us as nice people, but we're never there and we're not real. So we have a major challenge in terms of not only attending to our national defense, but our branding as reliable and conscientious friends and allies in the region.
Yeah.
So we're coming up on time. This has been absolutely fantastic, incredibly fascinating. This series is known to us as Expert Series, and I would not be doing my duty if I did not ask the experts the final question, which I always love to ask, which is, what is something important about the topic that we're discussing today, that Indo-Pacific region, that we missed that is essential to keep in the back of our minds as we go forward, thinking about developments in the South China Sea and in our foreign policy?
Well, I think what's happening in the South China Sea is emblematic of a larger regional uncertainty. And it's imperative for us as a nation to pay far more attention to what's going on in the Indo-Pacific. It is the great dynamo moving forward in this century, and many of our interests will in fact be tied directly or indirectly to that part of the world. And maintaining an element of peace and stability is thus very much, I think, in our national interest.
I think that what we may not have forgotten, but perhaps not insisted upon, is the novelty of the situation we are in. We can no longer take security guarantees for granted, and therefore we'll have to adjust to that. This is something that we all understand conceptually. This is not something that we have actually integrated in the way we practically look at things. I mean, this is one thing to posture in the South China Sea, doing naval diplomacy and so on and so forth, when we have the US and we're not sure what the US would do in some first. I'm not saying here that they won't do anything. This is not my point. What has been broken over the past 2 months is the certainty in the guarantees, and that changing everything, because as long as trust is there are a number of things that you can do when trust is no longer there, that you'll think twice before doing the very same thing that you were doing almost blindly before. So this is something that is going to be a decided factor in the way policies and decisions about capabilities and everything are going to be made over the forthcoming years.
Yeah, I think a takeaway is, war's not inevitable, but there's clearly a global conflict of what are becoming very articulate great powers. Both China and the United States are using language that's very reminiscent of 19th century concepts of great powers, and framing their clash as one that we all have to get seized by. And we may not have to get that seized by it, though we are affected by it. And we have to be aware that both sides want us to use language and arguments that favor their points of view. We have to be very savvy that we're not sucked into that kind of discussion. China is not necessarily an adversary of Canada. We have a lot of interests that are shared. We have a lot of things that we don't agree on, but our natural trade outlet or the Chinese diaspora in Canada, these are all good things, and they empower us. And to make China just an enemy because another great power says you need to be really leery of it, we need to be careful how we do that. And it doesn't mean we ignore the fact that we can look at China and see some patterns of behavior that are getting increasingly aggressive, and rhetoric that's increasingly aggressive, and a whole bunch of tools being used that we're not used to seeing being used. The United Works organization, fishing boats, social mobilization organizations. That's how they're doing their business. We just need to recognize that's how they operate.
Which means also that we're moving towards a much more fragmented world. I mean, we can no longer think strictly in terms of blocks, because we have a contradiction within our own national interests, between our interests and the challenges that a country like China poses. We'll have to adjust. Again, we're going to go towards issue-based coalition, which are going to be often on an ad hoc basis, meaning different things, but it's going to be much more difficult to think in terms of blocks and so on. And that's going to change. I mean, this is very difficult to foresee how far and deep this will go, and how this will change the way we think about our international relations beyond China eventually.
Doctors Michael Hennessy, James Boutlier, and Frederic Grare, your insight is greatly appreciated, and we're incredibly grateful for your time. Thank you very, very much for joining us.
And that's all for today's episode. The Expert Series is released every Tuesday and Thursday. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defense and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in this edition, email josh@cdainstitute.ca. This podcast was researched by our research assistants, Claire Parsons and Gabrielle Picton. I'm Josh Malm. Until next time.